Most mornings begin the same way. The house is quiet. The coffee maker hums softly somewhere behind you. Pale light slips through the edges of the curtains, turning the room silver before the sun has fully cleared the horizon. You reach for the blinds almost without thinking, following a routine you've repeated hundreds of times before. And then you see it, a blue jay, perched on the same branch just outside your window, motionless, waiting. At first, it doesn't seem unusual. Birds land in trees. Birds pass through yards. That's what they do. But something about this feels different. The branch sways slightly in the morning breeze. Leaves tremble. Shadows move across the fence line. Yet the blue jay remains perfectly still, its attention fixed in only one direction, toward the glass, toward the house, toward you. You tell yourself it's coincidence. Most people would. The bird is probably resting, watching for food, listening for other birds waking in the neighborhood. The explanation feels reasonable enough, yet the next morning it's there again. Same branch, same hour, the same patch of early light touching its blue feathers. And then the morning after that. By the end of the week, you begin looking for it before you even open the blinds. If you're new here, subscribe before you leave, because what you're about to discover may change the way you look at every bird that visits your home. The natural world notices far more than most people realize, and sometimes the smallest patterns become the hardest to ignore. But that is only the beginning, because the strange part is not that the blue jay keeps appearing. The strange part is the feeling that somewhere along the way, it started arriving before you did. You probably know this feeling, even if you have never spoken about it out loud. It starts with something small, so small that it barely seems worth mentioning. A glance toward the window before you have any reason to look. A quiet expectation you cannot explain. A sense that something familiar is already waiting outside. Most people brush these moments aside. They tell themselves they are imagining patterns where none exist. They tell themselves that routine can make ordinary things feel meaningful. And sometimes that is true. But there are experiences that settle somewhere deeper than logic, the kind that stay with you long after the moment has passed. Maybe you have felt it while driving the same road home every evening and suddenly noticing the same deer standing at the edge of the trees. Maybe it happened during a morning walk when the same bird seemed to appear from nowhere day after day. Not close enough to demand attention, just present enough to be remembered. There is something strangely personal about being noticed by a wild creature, especially one that owes you nothing. It does not know your name. It does not belong to you. Yet over time, its presence begins to feel woven into the fabric of your day. The blue jay outside the window was becoming exactly that. Part of the morning, part of the silence, before the world fully woke up. And what made it difficult to ignore was not what the bird was doing. It was what was happening inside you. The way your eyes searched for that branch without thinking. The way the room felt slightly different when it was empty. The way a simple appearance had quietly become an expectation. And this is where things begin to change. Because sometimes the most important patterns are not the ones happening around us. They are the ones we notice before we understand why. The curious thing was that the bird never seemed surprised to find you there. Morning after morning, as sunlight slowly climbed across the kitchen floor and the shadows pulled back from the fence, it appeared to arrive with a certainty that felt almost deliberate. It did not search the yard. It did not hop from branch to branch the way most birds do when they are exploring. Instead, it landed on the same weathered perch overlooking the window and settled into stillness, as if some part of its day had already been decided long before dawn. Most people never notice this layer of the natural world. We assume wild creatures move randomly through our lives, drifting from tree to tree without much thought. But when you begin paying attention, a different picture emerges, a quieter one. The blue jay seemed to know exactly where to be. Some mornings it arrived before the first car passed down the street. Other mornings it appeared while the neighborhood was still wrapped in that strange half-light between night and day. Yet somehow it was there with remarkable consistency, not demanding attention, simply present. And that is what made it feel so unusual. Because the more closely you watched, the more the bird appeared less like a visitor and more like a participant in a routine you had never realized was being shared. Its head would tilt slightly when movement stirred behind the glass. Its posture would change when the blinds shifted. Small details, easy to dismiss on their own, but together they created the faint impression of awareness. Not human awareness. Something quieter, something older. As though beyond the ordinary rhythm of your mornings, another rhythm had been unfolding all along. And once you noticed it, it became difficult to look away. What makes this even more fascinating is that the feeling is not entirely imagined. For a long time, people assumed that birds moved through the world almost entirely on instinct, responding only to food, weather, and danger. But over the past few decades, researchers have discovered something far more interesting. Many birds are paying attention to individuals, not just places, not just objects, individuals. The morning outside your window looked exactly as it always had. The same branch, the same fence, the same quiet light spreading across the yard. Yet now, there was a different way of seeing it. Because somewhere beyond the glass sat a creature capable of remembering far more than most people realize. Blue jays belong to a family of birds known for remarkable memory and observation. They learn routines, they recognize patterns, they remember locations with astonishing accuracy. More importantly, they learn which parts of their environment remain predictable over time, and that includes the humans who live within it. Suddenly, those small details felt different. The slight tilt of the bird's head, the way it seemed to arrive before the blinds opened, the calm confidence with which it settled onto the same branch. None of these things proved anything extraordinary, yet they no longer felt meaningless either. Sometimes, science does not make the mystery disappear. Sometimes, it deepens it, because the realization is not that the bird possesses some supernatural awareness. The realization is that a wild creature may have quietly incorporated you into its understanding of the world. Your movements, your schedule, your presence. And when you sit with that thought for a moment, listening to the distant sound of a lawn sprinkler turning somewhere down the block while early sunlight catches the edges of blue feathers outside the window, something about the entire experience begins to feel a little more real, and a little harder to dismiss. Without realizing it, you begin making room for the bird in your mornings, not physically, emotionally. The routine remains the same. The coffee still steams in the kitchen. The neighborhood still wakes slowly beneath the soft glow of early sunlight. Yet, somewhere between waking up and opening the blinds, a quiet expectation has settled into place. You look toward the branch before you even mean to. And most mornings, it is there. The distance between you never changes. Glass remains between the room and the outside world. A few yards of open air separate the window from the tree. Yet familiarity begins forming in the spaces between those distances. One morning, a light rain drifts across the yard, turning the fence posts dark with moisture. Tiny drops cling to the leaves. The bird arrives anyway. Another morning, low clouds cover the sky, and the entire world seems painted in shades of gray. Still it comes, not dramatically, not with any obvious purpose, simply appearing as though it belongs there. And that is when something subtle begins to happen. The branch no longer feels like just another branch. The window no longer feels like just another window. Certain places become meaningful because of repetition, because of memory, because something keeps returning to them. Some mornings, the bird fluffs its feathers against the cool air and settles into stillness. Other mornings, it shifts its weight and watches the yard below. Small behaviors, ordinary behaviors. Yet, after enough days, they no longer feel entirely ordinary. They feel familiar, almost comforting, as if both of you have unknowingly become part of the same ritual. And perhaps that is what makes these moments so powerful. Not that a connection suddenly appeared, but that it formed slowly enough for neither of you to notice exactly when it began. Then one morning, something feels different. Not outside, inside. The branch is still there. The fence still catches the first light of day. A breeze moves through the leaves with the same soft rustling sound you have heard 100 times before. Yet your thoughts are somewhere else. Perhaps you woke carrying a decision you have been avoiding. Perhaps an old memory surfaced in the quiet hours before dawn. Or perhaps it is one of those mornings when you cannot explain what feels unsettled, only that it does. You walk toward the window almost automatically. And there it is, waiting. The sight should not surprise you anymore. The pattern has repeated itself too many times. Yet this morning, the familiarity lands differently. The bird does nothing unusual. It does not fly closer. It does not call out. It simply occupies its place in the world with the same calm certainty it always has. And somehow, that makes the moment feel even stranger. Because what begins to change is not the behavior outside the glass. It is the meaning you attach to it. Human beings are natural pattern seekers. We notice repetitions. We remember timing. We connect moments that seem unrelated. Most of the time, those patterns fade as quickly as they appear. But occasionally one remains. It follows us through days, then weeks. It settles quietly into the background until it begins feeling less like coincidence and more like a question. Standing there in the pale morning light, you find yourself wondering something you had never considered before. Not why the bird keeps appearing. That question feels almost too small now. The deeper question is why its presence suddenly seems to matter. And what happens next only makes that question harder to ignore. Perhaps this is why experiences like these stay with people for years, not because they prove anything, not because they offer clear answers, but because they leave behind a feeling that is difficult to explain and even harder to forget. Many people believe that certain moments in nature arrive when our attention is needed most. Not as messages in any literal sense, but as reminders. Small interruptions in routine that cause us to pause long enough to notice something deeper. Standing by the window each morning, you begin to understand why that belief has endured for so long. The bird remains exactly what it has always been, a wild creature following its own life, its own instincts, its own invisible map of the world. Yet something about the repeated encounter feels larger than the simple facts alone. Maybe it is because the experience arrives so quietly. There is no dramatic event, no sudden revelation, just the steady accumulation of mornings, the soft scrape of blinds lifting, the pale gold light spreading across the yard, the familiar shape waiting on the branch. Day after day, week after week, over time, the pattern begins creating its own meaning. Not because the bird changes, because you do. Researchers often describe intuition as the mind recognizing patterns before conscious awareness catches up. Perhaps that is part of what is happening here. Perhaps some deeper part of you noticed the significance long before you found words for it. And that is where the mystery remains. Because whether spiritual or scientific, something about being acknowledged by the same small presence over and over again feels difficult to ignore. It creates the strange sense that life may contain layers we rarely notice. Layers hidden beneath schedules and routines and ordinary mornings. And once that possibility enters your mind, even gently, it changes the way you see what happens next. After a while, the need to explain everything begins to fade. The question is no longer whether the pattern is meaningful or accidental. The question itself becomes less important. What remains is the experience. A quiet one, the kind that settles into your life without announcing itself. Morning arrives as it always does. Light gathers slowly along the edges of the room. The neighborhood stretches awake. Somewhere in the distance, a garage door opens. A dog barks once and then falls silent. Ordinary sounds, ordinary moments. Yet, they no longer feel quite as empty as they once did. You walk to the window, not out of curiosity anymore. Out of habit, out of recognition. The branch waits beyond the glass. The leaves move gently in the breeze. And there it is. Nothing dramatic happens. The bird simply occupies its familiar place in the morning. Somehow that is enough. There is a certain peace that comes from repeated presence, from knowing that amid all the changes life brings, some small things continue returning, day after day, season after season. Standing there, you realize that perhaps the most meaningful part of this story was never the bird itself. It was the attention it awakened, the way it caused you to slow down, to notice, to become aware of details that had always been there but rarely held your focus. The shape of the tree against the sky, the shifting color of dawn, the stillness that exists for a few brief moments before the day fully begins. And maybe that is why experiences like this linger. They remind us that wonder does not always arrive through extraordinary events. Sometimes it arrives quietly, perched on an old branch outside a familiar window, waiting patiently for us to see what was already there all along. And then, one morning, the branch was empty. The light arrived exactly as it always had. A thin ribbon of gold stretched across the yard. The leaves stirred softly in the breeze. Somewhere beyond the neighboring houses, a mourning dove called into the quiet. Everything was familiar. Everything was unchanged, except for that one small absence. You stood at the window for a moment longer than usual. Then another moment, waiting without quite admitting to yourself that you were waiting. But the branch remained still. The next morning, you looked again, and the morning after that. Sometimes the bird returned, sometimes it did not. Yet by then, something important had already happened. The story was never really about predicting whether a bird would appear. It was about what its presence had awakened while it was there. A deeper attention, a quieter awareness, a reminder that the world is full of patterns, connections, and moments that exist just beyond the edge of what we usually notice. Whether spiritual or scientific, something about that feels worth sitting with, because perhaps the most meaningful experiences are not the ones that give us answers. Perhaps they are the ones that leave us asking better questions. Thank you for staying until the end of this journey. If stories like this speak to something in you, consider subscribing before you leave, because there are still countless mysteries hidden in ordinary places waiting to be noticed. And perhaps that is the real invitation. To keep looking, to keep wondering, to keep paying attention, because somewhere outside tonight, beneath the sky slowly darkening beyond a familiar window, a small blue shape may still be watching the world from the same old branch. Maybe it was only a bird, but somehow it never felt like only a bird.